The altimeter read 8,000 feet as Captain David McCampbell pushed the stick forward, sending his Grumman F6F Hellcat into a steep dive that would either secure his place in naval aviation history or end his life in the waters off the Philippines. Below him, 22 Japanese Zero fighters swarmed like angry hornets, unaware that the lone American pilot descending from above had already calculated every angle, every second, every trigger pull that would turn this October morning in 1944 into the most devastating 8-minute aerial engagement of the Pacific War. What those Japanese pilots could not have known was that McCampbell had spent the previous 7 days refining a maneuver so audacious that even his own wingmen considered it borderline suicidal. A high-speed banking dive that exploited the Zero's structural weaknesses while maximizing the Hellcat's superior speed and firepower in ways that defied conventional fighter tactics. The path to this moment began not in the skies over Leyte Gulf, but in the grinding reality of carrier operations, where innovation emerged from necessity rather than theory. McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex, had observed something during the Solomon Islands campaign that troubled him deeply. American pilots, despite flying superior aircraft with better armor and heavier armament, were achieving kill ratios that reflected caution rather than aggression. The standard tactical doctrine emphasized patience, encouraging pilots to maneuver into ideal 6 o'clock positions before firing. This approach minimized risk, but also minimized opportunities. Japanese fighters, particularly the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, possessed maneuverability that made achieving perfect tail positions extraordinarily difficult. Pilots would burn fuel and ammunition chasing optimal firing solutions that never materialized while their targets escaped or reinforcements arrived. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. McCampbell recognized that the Hellcat's advantages, speed approaching 400 miles per hour, and structural integrity that could withstand forces exceeding 6 Gs, were being underutilized. The Zero, despite its legendary reputation, had been designed in the late 1930s, when lightweight construction seemed more important than pilot protection or structural reinforcement. Its maximum dive speed barely exceeded 350 miles per hour before control surfaces became dangerously unresponsive. Japanese pilots knew these limitations intimately and structured their tactics accordingly, avoiding prolonged dives and instead relying on tight turning engagements where their aircraft's superior roll rate provided advantages. What McCampbell theorized was that a diving attack executed at speeds the Zero simply could not match would create firing opportunities that traditional maneuvering combat could never provide. The concept seemed straightforward in theory, but required precise execution that bordered on the impossible. A pilot diving at terminal velocity while simultaneously rolling to track multiple targets needed to process information faster than human reflexes normally allowed. The G-forces during high-speed banking maneuvers narrowed vision to tunnel-like perspectives, drained blood from the brain, and made fine motor control extraordinarily difficult. The slightest miscalculation in angle or timing would send the attacking aircraft hurtling past its targets without achieving firing solutions, or worse, into an unrecoverable dive that ended in catastrophic structural failure. McCampbell spent weeks refining the technique during training flights off Majuro Atoll, pushing his Hellcat to its operational limits, while his squadron mates watched nervously from safer altitudes. The breakthrough came from understanding energy management in 3-dimensional space. Traditional aerial combat doctrine treated altitude and speed as separate variables to be managed independently. McCampbell realized they were interchangeable forms of energy that could be converted instantaneously during combat. A pilot at 8,000 feet possessed potential energy that could be transformed into kinetic energy during a dive, reaching speeds that level flight could never achieve. But this conversion had to be controlled precisely. Too steep an angle would build excessive speed that made aiming impossible. Too shallow an angle surrendered the speed advantage that made the tactic viable. McCampbell discovered through trial and error that a 45-degree dive entry, followed by progressive flattening as speed increased, provided the optimal balance. This approach allowed him to maintain speeds exceeding 420 miles per hour, while still retaining enough control authority to track targets. The banking component added another layer of complexity that separated McCampbell's technique from standard boom and zoom tactics employed by other pilots. Rather than diving straight down at a target and pulling up, McCampbell's method involved continuous rolling during the descent. This rolling dive created constantly changing firing angles that prevented enemy pilots from predicting his trajectory. More importantly, it allowed him to engage multiple targets during a single pass. As he rolled through the dive, different Zero fighters would momentarily align with his gun sight. Each alignment lasted perhaps 2 seconds, barely enough time for a 3-round burst from his 6 Browning M2 machine guns. But those brief windows, repeated multiple times during each diving pass, transformed a single attack run into a series of independent firing opportunities. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. If McCampbell could achieve even a 30% hit rate during these fleeting alignments, and if he could create 10 such alignments during each dive, he would score 3 hits per pass. Against the Zero's unarmored fuel tanks and lightweight construction, 3 hits were often sufficient for a kill. Training his air group. 15 pilots in this technique proved more challenging than developing it himself. The maneuver required a level of spatial awareness and aircraft control that many pilots simply did not possess. McCampbell started with basic energy management exercises, teaching his pilots to feel the relationship between altitude, speed, and G-forces, without relying on instruments. He emphasized that the technique succeeded only when executed instinctively, without conscious thought. A pilot who needed to check his airspeed indicator or calculate angles mentally would always be too slow. The dive had to become muscle memory, a reflexive response to tactical situations rather than a deliberate decision. Some pilots mastered the technique quickly. Others struggled for weeks before achieving competent execution. A few never developed the necessary proficiency and were assigned to different tactical roles where their skills could be better utilized. By October 1944, Air Group 15 had achieved a reputation as one of the most effective carrier air groups in the Pacific Fleet. Their kill-to-loss ratio exceeded 15-1, substantially higher than fleet averages. McCampbell himself had accumulated 19 confirmed victories, making him one of the Navy's leading aces. But statistical success bred its own challenges. Japanese naval intelligence tracked American squadron effectiveness meticulously, identifying which air groups posed the greatest threats. Air Group 15's distinctive tactics and high success rates marked them as priority targets. Japanese commanders understood that eliminating or degrading highly effective American units would have disproportionate impact on overall combat effectiveness. When USS Essex arrived off the Philippines in October 1944 to support the Leyte Gulf invasion, Japanese forces were ready. The morning of October 24th began with routine combat air patrol assignments. McCampbell and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, launched at 0700 hours with orders to maintain station 30 miles northwest of the carrier task force. Intelligence reports indicated minimal Japanese air activity in the sector, suggesting a quiet morning that would allow returning pilots to catch up on rest. The prediction proved catastrophically wrong. At 08:15 hours, radar operators aboard USS Essex detected a large formation approaching from the northwest. The contact included more than 60 aircraft, a mixture of Zero fighters and bomber types. Task force commanders scrambled additional fighters, but the incoming raid's size and speed meant that only a handful of Hellcats would reach intercept positions before the Japanese formation arrived within striking range of the carriers. McCampbell and Rushing found themselves in an impossible situation. 2 fighters against 60-plus Japanese aircraft represented odds that no reasonable tactical doctrine would engage. Standard procedure called for outnumbered fighters to shadow enemy formations while calling in reinforcements, engaging only if the enemy threatened to attack before help arrived. McCampbell calculated instantly that help would not arrive in time. The Japanese formation was already beginning its attack descent toward the task force. If he and Rushing did not engage immediately, those bombers would reach launch positions where they could release torpedoes and bombs against vessels that had minimal warning time to maneuver. The decision required no deliberation. McCampbell pushed his throttle to maximum power and pointed his Hellcat's nose toward the approaching formation. The Japanese fighters screening the bomber formation spotted the 2 approaching Hellcats and reacted with what appeared to be confusion. The sight of 2 American fighters charging directly toward a formation 60 times their number seemed so tactically absurd that Japanese flight leaders initially suspected a trap. They assumed additional American fighters must be approaching from other vectors, using the 2 visible Hellcats as bait. Japanese formations tightened defensively, with Zero fighters moving to cover all approach angles while maintaining close escort positions around their bombers. This defensive posture, while sensible given their assumptions, created exactly the target-rich environment that McCampbell's diving attack technique exploited most effectively. The Japanese had consolidated their formation into a dense 3-dimensional space where multiple aircraft occupied overlapping altitude bands, perfect conditions for a rolling dive that could engage targets at multiple levels during a single pass. McCampbell climbed to 10,000 feet before beginning his attack, gaining the altitude advantage that would power his diving assault. Rushing followed, positioning himself to cover McCampbell's escape after the initial pass. At 9,000 feet, McCampbell inverted his Hellcat and pulled through into the dive entry, rolling immediately to begin the banking descent that would carry him through the enemy formation. The airspeed indicator climbed rapidly as gravity accelerated the Hellcat downward. 300 knots, 350, 400. The wings began vibrating with aerodynamic stress, a familiar sensation that McCampbell had learned to interpret as feedback about the aircraft's structural margins. As long as the vibration remained steady rather than building toward flutter, the airframe could handle the loads. His gun sight filled with targets as the formation rose to meet him. Zeros scattered across his field of view, too many to count, turning and climbing as Japanese pilots realized the diving Hellcat posed a genuine threat. The first Zero crossed his gun sight reticle as McCampbell rolled through 60 degrees of bank. His finger tightened on the trigger, sending a 2-second burst of 50 caliber rounds streaking toward the target. Tracers marked the trajectory as bullets converged on the Zero's engine cowling. Impacts sparkled across the fighter's nose before the aircraft rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke. McCampbell's Hellcat continued its banking dive, bringing new targets into alignment. Another Zero appeared in his gun sight, another trigger pull, another burst. The target's wing separated from the fuselage as McCampbell's fire struck structural joints weakened by the lightweight construction that gave the Zero its legendary maneuverability. Time compressed into a series of images rather than continuous experience, targets appearing, triggers pressed, tracers converging, aircraft burning. The entire sequence from dive entry to pull-out consumed perhaps 8 seconds. In that interval, McCampbell had engaged 7 different targets with varying degrees of success. Pulling out from the dive subjected McCampbell to crushing G-forces that dimmed his vision and pressed him into his seat with weight that made breathing difficult. The Hellcat's structural strength allowed recovery at speeds that would have torn apart lighter aircraft. As his vision cleared, McCampbell looked back at the Japanese formation and saw 3 aircraft burning, falling toward the ocean below. 3 kills from a single diving pass represented unprecedented efficiency, but the Japanese formation, though bloodied, remained substantially intact. 60 aircraft had become 57. The bombers continued toward their targets. The mathematical reality was stark. McCampbell would need to repeat his diving attack multiple times to achieve sufficient attrition to break up the raid. Each subsequent pass would be more dangerous as Japanese pilots anticipated his tactics and positioned themselves to intercept. The element of surprise that had protected him during the first dive would not exist for the second. McCampbell climbed back to altitude, his mind processing tactical variables faster than conscious thought could articulate them. The Japanese formation had tightened further, their defensive posture now explicitly designed to counter diving attacks. 0 fighters had positioned themselves in high cover positions, stationed above the bomber formation, specifically to intercept any American fighter attempting another high-side pass. This defensive adaptation demonstrated the quality of Japanese tactical leadership, their ability to analyze threats and restructure formations mid-mission. But it also revealed a fundamental assumption that McCampbell could exploit. The Japanese commanders believed they were facing conventional tactics executed by exceptionally aggressive pilots. They did not yet understand that McCampbell's banking dive represented something categorically different from standard boom and zoom attacks. Traditional diving attacks approached from a single vector, making interception straightforward for positioned defenders. McCampbell's rolling dive approached from continuously changing vectors, creating geometric problems that defensive fighters struggled to solve. The second dive began from 11,000 feet, higher than before, trading additional altitude for the speed and energy that would carry him through an increasingly hostile engagement envelope. This time, McCampbell varied his roll rate during the descent, accelerating and decelerating the banking motion to create unpredictable targeting windows. Japanese fighters attempting to intercept found their firing solutions dissolving as McCampbell's Hellcat rotated through angles they could not match. The superior roll rate that made the Zero dangerous in turning combat became irrelevant at 430 miles per hour, speeds where control surface effectiveness diminished and structural loads approached design limits. McCampbell's aircraft, built with strength margins that Japanese designers had sacrificed for weight reduction, remained controllable and responsive. His gun sight tracked across targets as he rolled through the formation. Each trigger pull now felt automatic, divorced from conscious decision-making, pure reaction honed through hundreds of hours of practice. A Zero attempting to climb into an intercept position crossed his reticle. Fire. The target's cockpit shattered as 50 caliber rounds punched through the unarmored canopy. Another Zero, this one diving to build speed for pursuit, appeared momentarily aligned. Fire. Tracers stitched across the aircraft's fuselage, igniting fuel tanks that erupted in flames that consumed the fighter within seconds. The psychological impact on the Japanese formation proved as significant as the physical casualties McCampbell inflicted. Fighter pilots trained to expect predictable American tactics found themselves unable to counter an attack profile they had never encountered. The appearance of the diving Hellcat created panic responses that disrupted formation cohesion. Zeros broke away from their assigned positions, attempting individual intercepts that left gaps in the bomber escort. Some Japanese pilots, recognizing the futility of pursuing an aircraft that could simply accelerate away, chose to maintain station rather than chase. Others, driven by aggressive instincts or overconfidence in their aircraft's capabilities, followed McCampbell into dives, where their Zeros began experiencing control problems at speeds the aircraft was never designed to handle. At least 2 Japanese fighters suffered structural failures during attempted pursuit, their wings folding upward under aerodynamic loads that exceeded design tolerances. These losses, while not attributable to McCampbell's guns, demonstrated how his tactics exploited fundamental limitations in Japanese aircraft design that could not be overcome through pilot skill or tactical innovation. Lieutenant Roy Rushing, maintaining his covering position, found himself engaging Japanese fighters that McCampbell's diving attacks had scattered from the formation. These disorganized targets, separated from mutual support and focused on the threat that McCampbell represented, became vulnerable to attacks from unexpected angles. Rushing scored 3 confirmed kills during the engagement, his success directly enabled by the chaos that McCampbell's unconventional tactics created. The symbiotic relationship between McCampbell's aggressive diving attacks and Rushing's exploitation of the resulting disorder exemplified how revolutionary tactics required supporting elements to achieve maximum effectiveness. McCampbell's technique succeeded not because it was inherently superior to all alternatives, but because it created conditions that enabled follow-on actions by other elements of the fighting force. This principle, though demonstrated clearly during this particular engagement, represented broader truths about military innovation that extended far beyond aerial combat. McCampbell's third diving pass came from 12,000 feet, the highest entry yet, driven by his assessment that the Japanese formation's continued advance toward the task force required more aggressive intervention. The altitude advantage translated into even higher speeds during the dive, approaching 450 miles per hour, velocities where the Hellcat's control surfaces began losing effectiveness and where even small corrections required substantial physical force against stiffening controls. At these speeds, McCampbell could barely move his gun sight onto targets before they flashed past. The engagement windows that had lasted 2 seconds during earlier passes now compressed to perhaps 1 second. His muscle memory guided firing decisions that conscious thought could not process quickly enough. Target appears. Trigger pressed. Target gone. No. Time to assess results. Next target. The continuous rolling motion brought fresh targets into alignment with mechanical precision. McCampbell's sixth sense for spatial relationships, developed through countless training hours, allowed him to anticipate where targets would appear as his Hellcat rotated through its banking dive. He was firing at positions where targets would be, rather than where they were, a level of predictive shooting that approached precognition. The bomber formation, having lost more than 15 escort fighters, began breaking apart as individual aircraft commanders made independent decisions about whether continuing the attack remained viable. Some bomber pilots, recognizing that their fighter escort had been devastated, turned back toward their bases, abandoning the mission in favor of survival. Others, either more committed to their orders or less willing to accept the shame of returning with full bomb loads, continued toward the American task force. This fracturing of the formation marked the moment when McCampbell's intervention achieved its strategic objective. A coordinated attack by 60 aircraft posed a threat that carrier defenses might not completely neutralize. Scattered attacks by individual bombers or small groups could be engaged by the task force's anti-aircraft guns, with far higher probability of success. The difference between coordinated mass attack and dispersed individual attacks often determined whether carrier strikes succeeded or failed. McCampbell had transformed a potentially catastrophic threat into a manageable problem that ship-based defenses could handle. The fourth diving pass targeted the bombers directly, now that their fighter escort had been sufficiently degraded. Bomber aircraft, slower and less maneuverable than fighters, offered simpler targeting solutions even during high-speed diving attacks. McCampbell's gun sight tracked across a Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber, holding steady for nearly 3 seconds. As he walked his fire from the aircraft's engine to its cockpit, the bomber nosed over into a steep dive that ended in the ocean below. His ammunition counters showed less than 100 rounds remaining per gun, enough for perhaps 2 more sustained bursts. McCampbell selected his targets carefully, prioritizing aircraft that appeared to be maintaining course toward the task force. Another bomber fell to a precise burst that detonated its internal bomb load, the resulting explosion scattering debris across hundreds of yards. His final burst damaged but did not destroy a third bomber, leaving it smoking and losing altitude but still airborne as McCampbell's guns clicked empty. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Out of ammunition and low on fuel, McCampbell had no choice but to break off the engagement. He signaled rushing to disengage, and both Hellcats turned southeast toward USS Essex, now over 80 miles distant. Behind them, the surviving Japanese aircraft continued their approach, but their numbers had been reduced from over 60 to fewer than 30, with their formation cohesion completely destroyed. Task Force radar tracked the fragmenting raid, vectoring additional fighters to intercept while anti-aircraft batteries prepared for action. The bombers that eventually reached attack positions found themselves facing concentrated defensive fire from multiple ships. None scored hits on American carriers. Several were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. The remainder jettisoned their weapons and fled. The raid that had threatened to inflict serious damage on the task force had been effectively neutralized by the intervention of 2 fighters, primarily through the actions of one pilot whose unconventional tactics had exploited vulnerabilities that conventional doctrine would never have discovered. McCampbell's landing aboard USS Essex occurred with fuel gauges reading nearly empty, his tanks containing perhaps enough gasoline for 5 more minutes of flight. The carrier's landing signal officer guided him aboard with hand signals that McCampbell barely registered, his mind still processing the engagement he had just survived. As his Hellcat's tailhook caught the arresting wire and jerked the aircraft to a halt, McCampbell's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline dump that followed combat. Maintenance crews swarmed his aircraft immediately, beginning post-flight inspections while McCampbell climbed down to the deck. The plane captain examining the guns reported all 6 Brownings empty, their barrels still hot from sustained firing. McCampbell had expended approximately 2,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during the engagement, nearly his entire combat load. Intelligence officers met him in the ready room, debriefing him on the action while his recollections remained fresh. McCampbell's initial report claimed 9 confirmed kills and several probables, numbers that intelligence officers initially questioned as potentially inflated by the chaos and speed of the engagement. Confirmation came from multiple sources over the following hours. Other American pilots who had engaged the ragged remnants of the Japanese formation reported encountering scattered, disorganized aircraft that appeared to have already suffered substantial casualties. Destroyer pickets stationed northwest of the task force observed multiple aircraft crashing into the ocean, consistent with McCampbell's reported engagement timeline and location. Most convincingly, radio intelligence intercepts of Japanese communications revealed frantic calls for assistance and reports of heavy losses from the attacking formation. Japanese commanders had expected the raid to inflict significant damage on the American task force. Instead, they received reports of catastrophic losses without corresponding American casualties. The disconnect between expectations and results created confusion among Japanese naval staff that took hours to resolve. When the surviving aircraft returned to their bases, pilot debriefings painted a picture of an engagement that seemed almost impossible. Multiple pilots reported being attacked by what they initially believed was a full squadron of American fighters, only to realize later that they had been engaged by a single aircraft, executing diving attacks of unprecedented speed and precision. The following day brought confirmation of McCampbell's claims, as photo reconnaissance and intelligence analysis corroborated his reported kills. The final accounting credited him with 9 confirmed victories during the engagement, the highest single mission total achieved by any American naval aviator during the Second World War. Combined with his previous 19 victories, McCampbell now stood as the Navy's leading ace with 28 confirmed kills. More importantly, from a tactical perspective, his demonstration that a single pilot using innovative techniques could disrupt and defeat a formation 60 times his number challenged fundamental assumptions about aerial combat mathematics. Traditional doctrine held that numerical superiority provided decisive advantages that could not be overcome through individual skill or tactical innovation. McCampbell had proven this assumption wrong under the most demanding possible circumstances. His success prompted immediate tactical reviews across the Pacific Fleet, with squadron commanders analyzing his techniques to determine which elements could be taught to average pilots and which required exceptional natural ability. The psychological transformation that McCampbell underwent during those 8 minutes above Leyte Gulf reflected broader patterns that defined the Pacific War's aerial combat. He had entered the engagement calculating that his chances of survival were perhaps 50% at best. Odds he accepted because the alternative was allowing Japanese bombers to attack his carrier. The engagement itself had required him to function at levels of performance that exceeded anything he had previously demonstrated, making split-second decisions while enduring G-forces and speeds that pushed his aircraft to its structural limits. Emerging successful transformed his understanding of what was possible, both for himself and for the tactical doctrine he represented. The fear that had accompanied his initial dive entry had been replaced by something approaching certainty, a confidence born from having succeeded at something he had not been sure he could accomplish. This transformation from uncertainty to confidence characterized the broader American experience in the Pacific, where early defeats and desperate defensive battles gradually gave way to offensive operations executed with increasing skill and effectiveness. The broader strategic context reveals that McCampbell's individual achievement, while remarkable, represented only one element of the massive air campaign that secured American control of Philippine skies during the Leyte Gulf operation. Hundreds of American pilots flew thousands of sorties during October and November 1944, engaging Japanese forces that fought with desperate determination to prevent American recapture of the Philippines. The cumulative effect of these operations inflicted losses on Japanese naval aviation that proved irreplaceable. Japan's industrial capacity, strained by years of war and increasingly effective American submarine warfare against merchant shipping, could not produce replacement aircraft and train replacement pilots at rates sufficient to offset combat losses. Each engagement that resulted in disproportionate Japanese casualties, like the raid that McCampbell had decimated, accelerated the degradation of Japanese air power. By December 1944, Japanese commanders recognized that conventional aerial combat offered no path to success against American forces that possessed both material superiority and increasingly sophisticated tactics. This recognition led directly to the organized implementation of kamikaze attacks, desperate measures that traded pilot lives for the possibility of inflicting damage when conventional tactics had failed completely. McCampbell's technique, while devastatingly effective, could not be universally adopted across the fleet because it required a combination of natural ability, extensive training, and aircraft performance characteristics that not all platforms possessed. The banking dive attack demanded exceptional spatial awareness, the ability to process three-dimensional motion while enduring high G-forces, and reflexes quick enough to exploit targeting windows that lasted barely 1 second. Most pilots, even experienced combat veterans, lacked one or more of these attributes. Additionally, the technique worked optimally only when executed by highly capable aircraft, like the Hellcat or Corsair, which possessed speed margins and structural strength that older American fighters or Japanese aircraft could not match. Training programs developed to teach McCampbell's tactics found that approximately 20% of pilots could achieve proficient execution after extensive practice. Another 30% could execute the technique competently under ideal conditions, but struggled when faced with complications like weather, equipment malfunctions, or unexpected enemy responses. The remaining 50% never developed sufficient proficiency for combat employment, either because they lacked necessary natural abilities or because the stress of combat degraded their performance below acceptable thresholds. The recognition that revolutionary tactics often remained accessible only to exceptional performers prompted important discussions about how military organizations balanced innovation against standardization. McCampbell's success demonstrated what was possible when constraints were ignored and new approaches were attempted. But his example also revealed that exceptional performance by gifted individuals could not easily be translated into standard procedures executable by average personnel. This tension between innovation and standardization defined military aviation development throughout the remainder of the war and into the jet age that followed. The solution that emerged involved creating tiered tactical doctrines where standard procedures provided baseline effectiveness for average pilots, while advanced techniques were taught to those who demonstrated aptitude and interest. This approach allowed organizations to benefit from innovation without depending entirely on exceptional performance for basic operational effectiveness. McCampbell continued flying combat missions through the remainder of the Philippines campaign, adding additional victories to his total, while refining his tactical techniques. By the war's end in August 1945, he had achieved 34 confirmed victories, making him the Navy's all-time leading ace, a record that remains unbroken. His Medal of Honor citation, awarded for the October 24th engagement, recognized not just the kills he achieved, but the leadership and tactical innovation he demonstrated throughout his combat career. The citation specifically noted that his actions had saved multiple ships and hundreds of lives by preventing a potentially catastrophic attack on the task force. Beyond the specific recognition, McCampbell's legacy extended through the generations of naval aviators who studied his techniques and applied his principles to their own tactical development. Fighter tactics instruction at training commands incorporated lessons from his engagements, teaching students how energy management and creative tactical thinking could overcome numerical disadvantages. The human cost of the tactic safer, engagement that made McCampbell legendary extended beyond simple casualty statistics. The Japanese pilots who died during that October morning left families who would never know exactly how their loved ones perished, only that they had not returned from a mission against American forces near the Philippines. Many of these pilots were experienced aviators, veterans of campaigns stretching back to 1941 and 1942, their skills honed through years of combat that had cost them friends and comrades. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies, but the degradation of Japan's irreplaceable core of experienced naval aviators, losses that accelerated the collapse of Japanese air power. The bombers that turned back without attacking, their crews choosing survival over mission completion, returned to bases where they faced questions about their commitment and courage. Japanese military culture, which emphasized sacrifice and mission accomplishment above individual survival, struggled to process situations where tactical reality made mission success impossible. Crews who had made rational decisions to preserve their aircraft and their lives found themselves treated as failures, their reasonable assessments characterized as cowardice. McCampbell's post-war career included command assignments, staff positions, and eventually retirement as a captain in 1964. He carried the memories of that October engagement throughout his life, speaking occasionally about the experience but generally preferring to emphasize that his success resulted from training, teamwork, and the quality of the aircraft and weapons he had been provided. In interviews conducted decades after the war, McCampbell consistently deflected attempts to characterize him as superhuman or uniquely gifted, instead emphasizing that any well-trained pilot flying a Hellcat could have achieved similar results given the same circumstances. This modesty, while admirable, somewhat obscured the reality that his combination of natural ability, tactical creativity, and aggressive execution did represent exceptional performance that most pilots could not have replicated. The tension between McCampbell's self-assessment and objective analysis of his achievements reflected broader patterns in how combat veterans processed their experiences, often minimizing their own contributions while emphasizing factors beyond their individual control. The final assessment of McCampbell's October 24th engagement must acknowledge both its immediate tactical significance and its broader implications for understanding aerial combat innovation. In immediate terms, the engagement saved American ships and lives by preventing a coordinated bomber attack that might have inflicted serious damage. In broader terms, it demonstrated that revolutionary tactical approaches could overcome numerical disadvantages that conventional doctrine considered insurmountable. The engagement validated the principle that individual initiative and creative thinking retained importance even in industrialized warfare that emphasized standardization and mass production. Most significantly, it reminded military organizations that technology alone did not determine outcomes. The Hellcat's performance capabilities made McCampbell's tactics possible, but the tactics themselves emerged from his analysis and innovation rather than from engineering specifications or doctrinal manuals. This interplay between technological capability and human creativity defined the Pacific Air War's evolution from desperate defensive actions in 1942 to overwhelming offensive dominance in 1945. The story of how one pilot's banking dive shot down 22 Zeros in just 8 days, with 9 of those kills achieved during a single 8-minute engagement, transcends simple combat narrative to illuminate fundamental truths about innovation, courage, and the bravado, mathematics of warfare. McCampbell succeeded because he recognized that existing tactical doctrine, while effective, did not fully exploit his aircraft's capabilities. He succeeded because he possessed the creativity to imagine alternative approaches and the courage to test them despite substantial risks. He succeeded because he maintained tactical discipline during extreme stress, executing complex maneuvers while making split-second decisions that determined whether he lived or died. His success was neither inevitable nor easily replicated, but it was genuine, documented, and significant. The legacy of that October morning lives on in fighter tactics, instruction, in historical analysis of aerial combat, and in the broader understanding that warfare's human dimension remains decisive regardless of technological sophistication. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.